Okay, this is some four-voice practice, 200 words per minute. We have Mr. Eberly for the people and Mr. Bryan for defense. I am attorney for the people, Mr. Eberly.
I am the witness.
I am the court.
Attorney for defense, Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bryan, for the record. Where was Mr. Martin when you first observed him after you arrived at the scene of the accident located at Central and West Main?
Walking across the roadway towards me.
Was he walking from the direction of the Corvette towards the direction of the pickup truck?
Yes.
Can you be any more precise as to where Mr. Martin was when you first saw him? Was he nearer the Corvette or nearer the pickup truck?
I would say that he was probably about halfway.
That would be about out in the middle of Central then, is that correct?
Fairly close, yes.
Is it your recollection that he had on a pair of pants, a suit-type vest, and a shirt when you first saw him?
Yes.
How long after you arrived at that location of this accident was it that you patted down Mr. Martin?
Within 15 to 20 seconds.
Did you summon Mr. Martin to come over to where you were located?
No, I did not.
Was Mr. Martin walking at a normal gait towards you as you first observed him that day?
Objection, assuming a fact not in evidence that he ever saw him walking before and knows what his normal gait is.
That's a fair objection. Let me rephrase it. Just describe how Mr. Martin was walking.
He had been summoned by Officer Moore. As far as I could see, there was nothing unusual about the way you walked.
Did you hear your brother, Officer Moore, summon Mr. Martin to come over?
Yes, I did.
On the 17th of December of last year, did you talk to Mr. Lucas?
Yes, I did.
Was that after you had patted down Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Did you talk to Mr. Lucas on the subject of a gun?
Yes.
Did Mr. Lucas indicate to you that he had seen Saul Rodriguez, the other man, place a gun in a paper bag?
Objection, hearsay.
Unless you're trying to
I ask you this.
impeach the other officer.
I'm only trying to impeach, and I'll make,
Impeach the brother officer?
yes.
Your Honor, I don't believe there was any testimony by the other officer about a conversation between Officer Hughes and this person we're talking about.
No, but there was a conversation. The other officer said,
I'd ask you not to say what it was, Your Honor.
all right.
Your Honor, I'm not going to say what the other conversation was, one that's not a conversation to which this officer was privy.
He may have been privy.
That hasn't been asked whether he was present at the other conversation. He may not have been privy. He's asking this officer what he discussed with Mr. Lucas after the fact and whether or not they...
I'll sustain the objection, but I'll permit you to enter this area in a different way if it's possible.
Where was Officer Russell Moore when you had this conversation that you're now describing with Mr. Lucas?
I don't know.
You were all still there at the scene, weren't you?
He was somewhere at the scene. I don't know exactly where he was. Could it have been across the street from you? He could have been, yes.
But you have no specific recall that your brother officer was not within earshot, do you?
No, I don't.
Okay. What did Mr. Lucas say to you on the subject of the gun?
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Does the court understand that I'm asking this only for the purpose of impeachment now?
Well, you told me that, and I thought that might be the reason. But whom are you trying to impeach?
I am trying to impeach
The
Officer
first officer Moore?
Russell Moore, yes, Your Honor.
But I don't.
Don't you have to do it through the witness Lucas?
Not necessarily, Your Honor, because I have Lucas and Russell Moore.
See, the only way that you can impeach, that you could impeach the other officer is if there was a conversation between the other officer and Lucas that this gentleman heard or was present at. Otherwise, you can't. You can't. That's not permitted. It's strictly hearsay. If we had Lucas here and we asked Lucas, Mr. Lucas, did you talk to Officer Moore at the scene? Yeah. Did you tell him A, B, or C? And he says, no, I never told him that. See, but you can't go through this gentleman here who was not privy or a party to that conversation between the other two people unless I'm wrong. I could be, but that's my ruling.
Okay, fair enough. Did you take a written statement from the witness, Mr. Lucas?
I wrote down what he told me
When did you write it down?
while doing my report shortly after booking Mr. Martin
Where?
at the Highway Patrol office.
Could you give me the approximate time, Officer Hughes?
May I look at my report?
Certainly, of course you can.
There's a question of relevance here, Mr. Bryan. I'll permit this question, but also if you have an offer of proof or shows relevancy or something leading to something relevant, we may have to ask you to go into a different point of inquiry. About what time was it when you got the statement?
Probably, pardon me, what was the question?
What time was it when you received the statement from Lucas, if you know?
What time was it I received the statement from Lucas?
Yeah,
That was probably about 25 minutes after 8.
you'd been there 15, 20 minutes or so?
Something like that, yes.
This was after you patted down the defendant,
Everything was after I patted down the defendant.
okay?
Did Officer Moore tell you that there had been a gun in the paper bag?
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled. I think it's for purposes of impeachment or attempted impeachment. Please answer the question.
Officer Moore told me that bystanders told him they had a gun. Did he tell you the gun was in the paper bag? I don't recall exactly who told me the gun had been in the paper bag and fell out. Is it your best recollection that Officer Moore told you that the gun had been in the paper bag and had fallen out? Like I said, I don't recall who told me that. But you're certain that your best recall is that someone told you that at the scene. Is that correct? Yes. Thank you very much, officer.
Officer, was that told to you before or after the pat down about the paper bag?
After.
Okay, I have no further questions.
Before the pat down, if I can remember correctly, your fellow officer said he's got a gun and pointed to Martin?
No.
Oh,
Officer Moore told me as I stepped out of the patrol car, the people here say they've got a bag of money and a gun.
who was he referring to, if you know? I mean, he was pointing to particular people.
He didn't point to anyone. He made the statement and turned away from me, facing Mr. Martin.
Okay. Why, did you pat anybody else down besides Martin?
I asked him, how many are there? And he said 2.
Your fellow officer said 2?
Yes.
And did he point in a particular direction?
He, at that time, ordered Mr. Martin and Mr. Rodriguez to come over here or something to that effect.
They were across the street?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
How many persons were there at the scene of the accident when you arrived there?
Well, Your Honor, well, I'll withdraw the objection.
Is there a 352, Your Honor?
No, there's no objection.
Okay.
How many people were there at the scene?
I could only guess probably 25 or 30. How many people were there in the vicinity of the Corvette when you arrived? I don't really know. There were people scattered all over the scene of the accident. And were there several people in addition to Mr. Martin and Mr. Rodriguez in the vicinity of the Corvette when you arrived? Like I said, the first time I saw Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Martin, they were about in the middle of the street coming towards us. Were there other people over in the vicinity of the Corvette as Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Martin when you arrived? I can't specifically recall. Were there other people in the vicinity of the pickup truck where Officer Moore was located when you arrived? No. No further questions.
Okay.
Okay, let's pick this up a little bit. We're gonna do this at 2:10, so 14. Beginning with a question by Mr. Eberly for the record. Officer, how did you know to pat down Mr. Martin as opposed to all the other people there?
Because Officer Moore ordered them to come over there, and that's the 2 that came forward, and they were the only ones approaching. I just assumed that that was the 2.
Okay, and had he told you 2 people involved?
That's correct.
I have no further questions. Your Honor, I'd ask that the People's Exhibit Number 1 be admitted into evidence. However, it be released to the officer so he can keep it in
No objection.
the CHP evidence locker.
Be received.
I have a certified copy of a prior conviction, which I have previously shown Mr. Bryan, arising out of Monterey County for felony 417B. I had asked that this be marked People's Number 2 for identification
Be received in evidence. Any objection?
and be received into evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Do you rest your case?
People rest, Your Honor.
You may step down. Okay, any evidence to present or any comment or both or either?
No, Your Honor. I have comment. I have no evidence.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't believe there was reasonable cause for what Officer Hughes did, Your Honor, in the pat down, and that's the thrust of my comment.
Okay, would you give me some details? Tell
Okay.
me why.
Okay.
Because the officer said that he was concerned for safety and he had received information through the brother officer that these people had a gun.
What people had a gun, Your Honor?
Well, these people, I see what the thrust is.
Who are these people? Excuse me for asking you, but I think that's a worthwhile way to go forward.
Absolutely. Okay, are you suggesting that there was a lack of proper communication between the brother officers justifying Hughes in particular and signaling Martin as his buddy as opposed to anybody else?
Most certainly, there were 25. I heard 25.
But we have Officer Moore summoning the defendant and Rodriguez across the street.
I think the officer testified he assumed they were summoned because they were coming across the street when he saw them. I don't believe there was any evidence of any direct quote from Officer Moore.
True.
He assumed. So here you have, there's an accident. Let's just use the number 25 because it's 20 or 30 or whatever. There's a number of people out there. There's a one-way one car accident over against the fence. And the officer says that there's a bag of money.
They've got a gun.
Someone has a gun. They've got a gun. Does that warrant searching all those people at the scene of the accident? I think that's the thrust.
No, but let me ask you this, Mr. Bryan.
Yes, sir?
I see your argument, and I think it may have some merit, and I don't blame you for making it. But as a judge, do you not think I have a right to make reasonable inferences based upon the evidence presented? And don't you agree? You don't have to agree with me.
Let me answer you right there. No, you can't make a reasonable inference based on the gun. I mean, for heaven's sake, there would be no such thing as reasonable evidence to conduct a search. The gun can't justify the search.
The fact that somebody has a gun does not justify the search.
I thought you were suggesting the fact that a gun was found, Your Honor. You said, doesn't the evidence justify to the judge?
No, doesn't Officer Moore conveying information concerning the possession of a gun by someone together with Moore asking or signaling the defendant and his buddy to come across the street?
I don't think that's the state of the evidence, Your Honor. He didn't say he saw him signal anybody to come across the street. Didn't he say he assumed?
No, I heard earlier Hughes testifying that he saw his brother officer waving and asking the defendant and his buddy to come across the street. Isn't that the evidence? I thought that was the evidence.
Yes, Your Honor.
I thought that was the evidence. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but if that is the evidence, can't I infer? Now, maybe I can't infer, but do you agree that maybe I could infer, not necessarily, but maybe that I reasonably could infer that these were the men with the gun that Officer Moore had reference to?
Judge, if in fact an experienced California Highway Patrol officer is there at the scene, and when his brother officer, and by his very appearance here, it clearly shows that he's been an officer for a long time, Hughes. If the first officer, Officer Moore, feels that someone out there has a gun and there's a bag of money.
Well, we know that Moore had one or two people whom he suspected of having a gun. He had it narrowed down to 2 people, not 25. Do you agree with that based on the evidence?
Yes,
Moore?
that's right.
Moore knew a lot more perhaps
Then Hughes?
than Hughes.
Of course.
Okay, but did Hughes know when he was patted down, Martin? That's a question.
The second officer, Hughes, arriving at the scene, and the first officer has information that there's a bag of money and a gun, and he motions, come here. Moore told us he was right next to him while he was looking in the bag. There's obviously a difference in the evidence, state of evidence, which isn't all that unusual. Time goes by.
Let me hear from our DA.
Let me start from where I consider to be the beginning of this question, Your Honor. If you'll remember, Officer Moore testified that the other person with Mr. Martin was wearing a t-shirt and a dark pair of pants. Under questioning by defense counsel, he got Mr. Martin to have his coat off. Now Officer Hughes arrives on the scene. He's immediately contacted by Officer Moore. Officer Moore says they have a bag of money.
They referring to who? I asked him if he pointed.
If you remember, he said they got a gun. I asked this officer that just testified how many people did he say? And he said 2 people. Okay, and that time coming across the street are 2 people, one in pants and a t-shirt. And we have no evidence that they weren't walking normally. One has his coat off. We have no evidence that he wasn't walking normally. We have no evidence that they were carrying guns in their hands. At that time, it was not the same as a situation where the CHP officer makes a stop and he goes up to the driver's door. They had 2 men. It was 8 in the morning. They had nothing in their hands and had their coats off and obviously no place that they could pull out a gun and start shooting. Now we get to the point where these 2 men are coming. There are other people at the scene, but both officers are there waiting for these 2 people heading. The other people are this way and other places. When the other gentleman, Mr. Rodriguez, comes, Officer Moore immediately starts patting him down. And he's with...
I didn't hear that evidence.
Yes, he testified he patted down the other person.
Moore did?
Moore patted down Rodriguez.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Bryan?
He was standing right next to the other defendant, Mr. Martin. That's why Mr. Moore didn't pat him down, because he was busy patting down Mr. Rodriguez.
Will you concede that point?
No. Well, that's the testimony received on direct by Mr. Moore, that he was patting down Mr. Rodriguez. But even assuming, and I believe this is the correct state of facts, but even assuming that Officer Hughes was wrong, and instead of going toward 2 men,
He reasonably believed they were the men?
he reasonably believed they were the men. What if he walked away to a 90-degree angle and walked across the street to the bar and started patting somebody down? If he reasonably believed that this was one of the 2 people with the gun and he found a gun on that man, that gun would be admissible because the officer had a reasonable belief in his mind that you'd handle a man with a gun. That flies in the face of all reason. An officer doesn't do that. If you think that guy over there has got a gun, you don't come over here. He had nothing, he didn't have that flap on his holster open. He didn't have his holster open. He didn't have anything. There wasn't anything that he communicated to Officer Hughes by word or deed that there's a guy over there with a gun. There's a paper bag full of money. There's a guy with a gun. One of those two guys has a gun. The only thing, and if you're right, that he summoned them to come here, and that's the most he did, there wasn't anything that Officer Hughes heard. And I thought Officer Hughes first said that he assumed that they'd been summoned. Perhaps I'm wrong there, and whatever is in the record is...
No, my understanding is that just what I said it was.
Okay, but Your Honor, it's even stronger on my side of the case. I mean, look at, and let's again think of all the people that, highway patrol officers that have been killed. Think of the Rodriguez case that's just gone down that Judge Koresh tried. It's an affair concerning the highway patrol officers that are making stops. That has to be in their minds.
I'm sure it was in Hughes's mind.
Sure. Is it reasonable to think that Officer Moore, the first officer on the scene, has information that he has a gun and he's going to make a motion?
Mr. Bryan, would you address that point? That's what I had in mind. I was wrong this morning.
Wrong this morning?
In a similar situation.
The only cases we had this morning dealt with my not having a witness here.
But the unlocked door, and you wanted me to infer because the window was broken into that it.
I have no objection to that ruling you made this morning. I just had an objection to bringing my witness back.
Sure, if you'll take a moment to address this issue.
Sure. I don't believe there was reasonable information in the possession of Officer Hughes, who arrived there, and 15 or 20 seconds, something like that, after he arrived, he patted down my client without any more information than he had.
Okay.
There wasn't any identification as to size, ethnic background, any type of detail whatsoever. There was merely the indication about a bag of money and a gun, and apparently some motion to come over here. I think that's the state of the evidence.
Okay.
That, to me, is the crux of the case.
That is from our, this will be some warm up from one of our 200s. We have Mr. Eberly for the people, Mr. Miller for defense. I am attorney for the people, Mr. Eberly.
I am the witness.
I am the court.
I am attorney for defense, Mr. Miller.
14th, please.
Mr. Miller, for the record. Okay, you mentioned, which way was the car, by the way, parked in the driveway? Was it parked with the hood towards the house or the trunk?
It was parked back in.
Backed in, okay. You said you walked within 5 feet of the car?
Yes.
Would that be walking along the sidewalk front of the car then?
Yes, it would be walking. The car was backed in and I walked past the car about 5 feet.
Past the hood of the car?
Right.
Now, you mentioned that you saw packages of meat that are, strike that. You saw packages that resemble packages you saw being unloaded from that car on the 22nd of November, the next day then, in Mark Norris's car. Is that correct?
No, not in Mark Norris's car, someone else's car.
All right, I'm sorry. But since you didn't see the packages closely the previous night, you don't know for sure that those were the same packages, do you?
Right.
Oh, who was your neighbor, by the way, that was with you when you saw Mark Norris putting packages in the car?
Marvin Hampton.
Mr. Hampton live on the same street?
He lives at the dead end of the court.
Thank you.
That's how I ended up walking 5 feet past the car just to go down to his place.
Now, there's something I haven't figured out, and I'm sure you can resolve it with a short explanation, Mr. DeBono.
Yes.
After you surprised him about what you thought was his stolen property, he did not leave the house at that time with you, did he?
He called the police and I was on my way back to my place to see if Mark was still in the area.
How did he get into the chase of Mark Norris?
He was in his truck and I was on my bicycle.